So one of my favourite artists is releasing his first album of all new material in over 10 years this week. That's on Friday, which is January the 20th, as of the time of recording here. So as a warm-up, if you like, for this release, and honestly, because I don't see too much of him on YouTube, beyond like archived broadcast interviews, track and album rips, occasional bits of live footage, I don't see many people talking about him. So I'm going to try and rectify that today. This is my primer, my personal selections, the pick, if you like, of the huge and massively varied back catalogue of the wonderful John Cale. So yeah, by the time you watch this video, the album may have already dropped. I'm not sure, it depends on my upload schedule, but this album, Mercy, will be his 17th solo album release in a recording career which has spanned nearly 60 years. Yeah, John will be 81 years old in a few months. Yeah, I mean, in album terms, this kind of stretches all the way back to, those earliest albums by the Velvet Underground. We're talking, mid to late 60s. The debut Velvet Underground album came out in 1967. Up to most recently, I believe, he released a reinterpretation of his 80s masterpiece, Music for a New Society, which he called M-Fans, and that came out in 2016. There's absolutely no way I can give you like a brief background to John Cale. He's been around for so long. So what we'll do is we'll talk about him as we talk about the music. But very briefly, yeah, John is a fellow countryman of mine. Yes, he was born in Garnant, Carmarthenshire. That's in the kind of the southwest corner of Wales in 1942. And his music, his reputation has long been a massive inspiration to generations of Welsh artists. He doesn't really get too much in the way of, nostalgia for anything. So you never really hear him harping too much on about his Welsh roots. Maybe he considers himself more of a New Yorker, or I understand he now lives in LA, so who can tell? Either way, a musician of enormous standing, who even at, his age is still fostering, collaborations with younger musicians, a lot of younger Welsh musicians as well. People like Kate LeBon, Kelly Lee Owens, Gweno. So yeah, I'm going to run through 20 of my favourite tracks spanning the entire of John's solo career. So I will only be looking at his solo studio releases. To go any wider than that would really inflate this video. But at the end, I will touch on a few of the kind of the more important kind of collaborations and other kind of bits and pieces of, what is a very long recording career. So yeah, I'm going to gloss completely over the Velvet Underground pretty much. I think those records have been discussed very widely, and I'm also not going to dwell too long on his production work. So here we go then. Yeah, 20 tracks from his studio recordings, solo releases only, all presented chronologically. First up, I've got Big White Cloud. This is from his debut solo album of 1970 called Vintage Violence. Yeah, so despite splitting from Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, because he wanted to be more avant-garde and Lou Reed was kind of looking to go in a more poppier direction, if you like, this is incredibly poppy. It's huge, it's glossy, it's emotional, very lush, orchestral pop. Yeah, this is just kind of a beautiful kind of late 60s, early 70s big pop production. So next I'm going to highlight 3 tracks from his album from 1973, Paris 1919. So there were a couple of instrumental studio releases in between this and Vintage Violence, but they fall into the kind of the more experimental kind of instrumental side of John's kind of art, really. That would be Church of Anthrax and The Academy in Peril. And I do that just to get to Paris 1919 because some claim it still to this day to be his best album. And it's hard to disagree. It's a stunning record. It's rich. It's literary, resonant, huge music, wonderful kind of lyrical depth, and a sense of history about it. Yeah, I think it really carries on that kind of the big pop experiment that he was doing on Vintage Violence, but it seems to open the doors to this huge kind of widescreen, dramatic, fantastic vision. Yeah, the title of the album, by the way, refers to the Treaty of Versailles signed in 1919, which sought to redress the causes that led to the First World War and ultimately, gave rise to the economic and the political conditions which led to World War II, the Cold War. So you could argue, and John was, I think, that Paris 1919, the signature of that treaty, was the source of everything that really shaped the 20th century. Anyway, the tracks I've selected are Endless Plane of Fortune, Hanky Panky Know How, and the title track, Paris 1919. Yeah, Endless Plane of Fortune is this huge kind of sweeping, swirling orchestral back number. The strings on this really channel that kind of Venus in Furs feel, but on a much bigger scale. And they take the song somewhere grander, much more melodic, more emotional. Hanky Panky Know-How, yeah, something in that kind of very simple kind of tambourine percussive backing recalls, something like I'll Be Your Mirror from, the Velvet Underground and Nico. It's a very similar, quite simple, warm pop song, but, elevated once more by these beautiful strings and the sustaining kind of organ tones. You can clearly see why a band like Yo La Tengo, covered this song and did it so well. It fits them like a glove. Yeah, and that title track, Paris 1919, it again just highlights, Cale's genius for string arrangements. Yeah, he was very talented. He was a child protege and given kind of scholarships to Goldsmiths and ultimately to Tanglewood in New York for his classical nous. And the UCLA orchestra strings, which were used on this album, in this track, they're very percussive, they're very stabbing. They punctuate this kind of vocal melody with all these la-la-las. Yeah, this is just a wonderful, wonderful track. Yeah, and while this is a longer primer of, his entire career, I would say that these tracks may form the ideal starting point if you're completely new to John Cale's music. So I'll jump forward to 1974 now, and I have another 3 tracks here from his album of that year, Fear. Yeah, Fear was the first of a run of 3 kind of quite quick-fire albums released in the space of 2 years, 74 and 75, on Island Records. Yeah, some very cool musicians were enlisted for these records. You get Brian Eno and Phil Manzanera of Roxy Music, Chris Spedding, also of Roxy Music. He played with the Pretenders. He was in the Wombles. And Phil Collins on one of the later albums of this trio. Yeah, and this trio of albums shows John kind of changing things up. He's reacting stylistically to the sounds that were emerging around him, that punk, the new wave, the New York City scene. He would shortly produce stuff like Patti Smith's, Horses, the Modern Lovers debut album. And the music on these 3 albums, I think, is less kind of chamber pop, less of that orchestral thing that he was doing on Paris 1919, less consciously pretty, more abrasive, definitely more chaotic and spontaneous. So my 3 picks from Fear are Fear is a Man's Best Friend, Ship of Fools, and Gun. 3 again from this one, just because it's so good. Fear is a Man's Best Friend is this kind of a piano-led, almost a rock and roll number, but it gets progressively more chaotic, more discordant, more kind of violent as it rumbles towards its close. Cale's vocal kind of degrades into a kind of a hoarse yelling by the song's conclusion. And if you're looking for another kind of New York precedent, you could consider this a kind of a kissing cousin, if you like, of some of John Lennon, Yoko Ono's songs in that immediate kind of post-Beatles period. Something like, Mother in particular, where, if you recall, John Lennon was really kind of, his voice was cracking and breaking with that. You get a lot of that feeling in this track. Ship of Fools is a kind of a quieter track almost. It dials back this kind of mania, the paranoia, into quite a kind of a rolling, pretty extended, Dylan-esque kind of number. It's a real kind of stream of consciousness, this stream of characters and locations cropping up that just seems to hop all across the globe. Cale sings about Tombstone, Memphis, and then Swansea and the Mumbles, Ammanford, his hometown Garnet, Tennessee, Arizona. He mentions Dracula in the song. This is kind of a really dreamy, kind of surreal joy of a track. It's lovely. But Gun takes us back to Fear, if you like, and it's got quite a simple chord progression. But it really melds that kind of hammering intensity of like the Stooges or the Velvet Underground, but with a kind of a cooler, slightly more new wave, maybe a Roxy music kind of, sensibility even. It's feverish, it's pounding, it's a violent, nihilistic tale. It's a classic example of what John Cale was about at this time. And now from the second album in this trio, that would be Slow Dazzle from 1975. I've chosen 2 tracks, and they are Mr. Wilson and Guts. Pretty similar band as for Fear on this album. And this was the first of 2 releases in 1975. And I think the 2 tracks I've chosen, illustrate the 2 extremes of Cale, what the kind of thing that he was exploring at this time. Mr. Wilson is kind of a bit more of that chamber pop feel again. It's very clever, it's very poppy, and it's a tribute to Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. You get a flavour of that kind of Paris 1919 sound, but it's definitely kind of hemmed into a more kind of a traditional a band kind of setting. Whereas at the other extreme, we have Guts, which really minds that kind of violent, transgressive, almost kind of confessional Cale that you got on the Fear album. And it is loosely based, there wasn't any murder involved, on a true story of infidelity. I think the revenge didn't really happen though. The infidelity in this case was Kevin Ayers, who did do something with Cale's wife. Yeah, it's foul-mouthed, it's funny. Cale is frothing at the mouth in this one. You can feel that kind of that drug-fueled paranoia. Yeah, this was 1970s New York, and John Cale was deep into his kind of drug period here. And on this track, it spills out totally unfiltered. Yeah, this is a great, great kind of slice of rock and roll, John Cale. Yeah, I do remember hearing Mike Watt playing a cover of this at one of the All Tomorrow's Parties festivals. I believe it was Shellax with one of his bands. I think it might have been Mike and the Second Men. And yeah, you could see that Mike was just loving playing this one. And now with just a single track from the third album of this kind of trilogy, which is Helen of Troy from 1975. The track I've selected is Cable Hogue. Yeah, I think this is the last really kind of coherent studio recording we get from John Cale in the 1970s. He did do a live album recorded at CBGB's called Sabotage, which was full of that kind of punk energy that he was kind of dining on at that time. Some good songs still, but you know, big on the provocation and the chaos. Yeah, but this track, Cable Hogue, you could consider one or two more others on this album, but one of those I particularly like to talk about, I will talk about later. You'll see why. So yeah, Cable Hogue is a song that's kind of loosely inspired by Sam Peckinpah's kind of comedy western of the early 1970s, The Ballad of Cable Hogue. And again, the song starts quite traditionally like a kind of almost like a cowboy lament. You can feel the adrenaline mounting as the song kind of gets towards its conclusion, and by the end, Cale is literally hoarsely yelling, screaming the protagonist's name over and over again. Cable, you can't leave me here. Cable, please. Yeah, it's seemingly kind of quite a slight conceit, quite a loose kind of premise, but it becomes devastatingly personal and up close by the song's close. Yeah, it's a great song. Next up, I've got a couple of tracks from what I think is probably the most underrated album of Cale's career, that one being Honi Soit from 1981. And this is an interesting album because I think it's the point where Cale kind of clicked back into gear with the prevailing moods again. This was kind of like post-punk heyday, and he hooked up for this album with Mike Thorne, the producer of Wire, Soft Cell, amongst others. And although lyrically it's quite a bleak listen, you know, there's a focus on, you know, imagery of war and violence, killing, death everywhere. It's a shinier, much more interesting sound on this record, I think. Anyway, the two tracks I'd highlight for this primer would be Wilson Joliet and Streets of Laredo. Yeah, Wilson Joliet, you know, he rocks this kind of really glistening, synthy, post-punk feel. It really works for this song. And again, you get Cale's voice gradually degenerating into this gargling fury by the song's conclusion. There are some choice words that I wouldn't like to use in there. But nonetheless, you know, this is clearly a very energized Cale, whether that's energized via various chemical means or not. But yeah, he sounds as dangerous as he did on Fear and on, you know, Gun, those kind of tracks from 6 years before. But somehow, you know, this seems to fit with the times a little better. And yes, Streets of Laredo, this kind of showcases his real knack, his ability to reimagine, you know, quite traditional material. You know, Streets of Laredo it's kind of an old traditional, it's like a cowboy standard, but he completely cuts it up and it's rendered very edgy and scary and thrilling. You know, there's viola featuring in this again heavily. Always good to hear that on a John Cale record. Yeah, as a whole, this album is really ripe, I think, for, you know, contemporary listeners to rediscover and reevaluate. I think it's great. And now I've got a couple of tracks from what a lot of people would consider his mid-career masterpiece, and that would be Music for a New Society from 1982. And I think this album shows kind of a lowering of the temperature slightly. The bleakness, the anger is still there, but the music is much more cold and detached, and it sounds, you know, almost on the brink of despair, of depression. You know, it's a very dark album. Yeah, you could draw some kind of lines between this and some of the soundscapes he helped create on those kind of early Nico records. Yeah, John to this day claims that a lot of these songs were essentially improvised in the studio. And to me, that makes the album an even more incredible feat, really. Yeah, so the two tracks I've chosen from New Society are Chinese Envoy and Close Watch. So, Chinese Envoy, foregrounds this very delicate kind of treated acoustic guitar with Cale's viola kind of coiling around it. And you got little kind of splashes of, keyboard and Rhodes piano. Cale's voice sounds very weary and desperately barren and mournful. It's a very, very beautiful kind of spidery sound. And again, with Close Watch, we see that kind of need to constantly reinterpret, to move forward with your music, even if that means completely dusting down an old track and just, resetting it. Yeah, Close Watch is a reworking of a track from Helen of Troy called I Keep a Close Watch. The title comes from, of course, the opening line of Johnny Cash's I Walk the Line. And here on this album, in this setting, it's stripped back essentially to, piano with Cale's hugely reverbed voice. It just sounds alone and bereft in a completely, cavernous kind of emptiness. Yeah, you get little, stabs of what sounds like, auto harp, occasional drum hits. Yeah, you can get some bagpipe at the end. For me, this is my favorite take of this song. It's a song that he's revisited again and would do so again in the future. So moving on to 1985, and I want to just highlight a single track from his album of this year, which is Artificial Intelligence. Yeah, I'm skipping over Caribbean Sunset, the album from 1984, which I think is quite poppy, but it's flat at the same time. A couple of the tracks maybe stand out a little, but I guess it's about as inessential as John Cale got at this time. And that was a similar criticism that was leveled at artificial intelligence. People said, yeah, this is just not, there's not enough here. But there was one big exception, and that's the track I want to talk about from it. It's one of John's best songs ever. And that song is Dying on the Vine. Yeah, and even though the lyrics for this entire album, including this song, weren't John's, they were actually written by a music journalist called Larry Sloman. Cale has always been very, very keen to point out that this song, to him, feels deeply autobiographical. In the chorus, he says, yeah, but I was thinking about my mother. I was thinking about what's mine. I was living my life like a Hollywood, but I was dying on the vine. Yeah, it's a beautiful, sad, kind of warm yet cold at the same time. It's a very pulsing song that feels impossibly kind of lost and wistful even. But it's got this oddly defiant kind of lift around it. It's got that line in it about his mother. Yeah, and I think this was a kind of a turning point time for John. This was the point where he kind of got clean. He quit drugs. He started playing squash really heavily. And his daughter Eden was also born in this year. Yeah, this song, it definitely sounds like a turning point. There's this imagery of the shame of living a, outwardly successful life, but at the same time, the Hollywood life, but at the same time, you're dying on the vine. Yeah, it's an amazing song and a pivotal one in John Cale's discography. Yeah, I'm going to skip forward quite a way now from 1985 all the way through to 1996 with a track from his album Walking on Locusts. Yeah, quite a big jump here because his late 80s, early 90s period was quite full of a lot of, he did a lot of live recordings. He did a lot of collaborative stuff. And I'm really just focusing on the solo things here. But we might come back to that collaboration later. Yeah, this album feels like the first proper solo studio release of this period. And again, it's got that clearer, cleaner, poppier thing. But it definitely feels a more balanced, more successful album as a whole than maybe Caribbean Sunset or Artificial Intelligence. Anyway, the track I'm picking from this album is Set Me Free. Yeah, I think it's the real pick from this album. It's just a beautifully simple song that, if anything, resembles, a later period, non-John Cale Velvet Underground. It's very reminiscent of one of those pretty Velvet Underground songs like Pale Blue Eyes or Candy Says. And again, we're going to hop forward even further again now to 2003 with two tracks from his album of that year, Homo Sapiens. And as an aside, yeah, remember all those reinterpretations, reimagining? Yep, we get John reworking Set Me Free, the track I was just talking about. This time he kind of popped it in as a hidden track, one of those ones that you would have to rewind at the start of a CD from track one. Do you remember those? That was where you got Set Me Free on Homo Sapiens, on the CD release of it, at least anyway. But yeah, this album, Homo Sapiens, again, this is kind of a late period John Cale classic. Many, in fact, do think that it rivals Paris 1919 as the best album that he's ever released. I would say you certainly had to go back as far as Honi Soit to find, as consistently great a Cale solo album. Yeah, this album is heavily written and structured around samples. It's very electronic. But it balances the poppiness on the surface that it has with some quite challenging songs as well. It's a very balanced album, and it feels thoroughly modern. It never actually comes across, though, like one of those albums where you get an old rocker, an old stager who suddenly, decides, oh, I'm going to go techno, I'm going to go electronic. You never get that feeling on this album. It just sounds current. And I would agree, it is a quite brilliant album. Anyway, the two tracks I'm highlighting here for this primer list are Archimedes and Magritte. So Archimedes is this joyous, kind of burbling, impressionistic little pop song that bounces along on this very funky, chewy bass line with just complete airy abandon. Yeah, John's voice sounds absolutely majestic on this album, and I think on this track in particular. And on Magritte, yeah, we get an appearance of Cale's viola again, this time meshing in a beautiful way with this almost kind of, hip hop. It almost sounds like a trap beat, and you get this feeling of a moody kind of rumination of the artist himself, of Magritte. And on this track, Cale gets to use that devastating falsetto that he could break out every now and then. It's just magnificent. It's a wonderful song. So skipping forward just a couple of years to 2005, he released the album Black Acetate, and I'd like to talk about the track Gravel Drive from that album. Yeah, this whole album, it kind of pulls back a little from that kind of upfront, very sample-heavy approach on Homo Sapiens. It still sounds like a modern John Cale, but he definitely seems to be trying to meld some of that album's, the technological tricks and tropes and stuff with a more direct kind of band style. And Gravel Drive is a beautiful song. It really, it fuses this almost kind of ambient or even a kind of a post-rock kind of pad or a drone feel, but with a very heartfelt lyric. It's almost a ballad. It's about missing loved ones, about home. I think it's as sweet and lovely a song as Cale has ever written. And yet, finally getting up to what was his last full studio release in 2012, which was Shifty Adventures in Nookie Wood. Yeah, the track I'd focus on this one is called Scotland Yard. Yeah, but first the album. Yeah, it's another shift. That focus on mixing up electronic beats and keyboard sounds and samples that he'd been working on. It's still there, but it feels kind of more confident. He even uses a little auto tuning on his voice on a few tracks here. Yeah, to me this album captures the feel of some of Bowie's later period, maybe 90s, early noughties stuff. The kind of heathen, earthling, outside, that kind of feel. When Bowie was trying on Jungle and all that, I get a feeling of that with this album, but it never really loses the essential kind of John Cale, in much the same way that they always sounded like Bowie albums too. But yeah, the track Scotland Yard, yeah, it's got these kind of real punching beats and with these very icy, cold, kind of Gary Newman-esque almost synths, chained to a very prowling, a very menacing song that wouldn't, bar for the instrumentation, sound out of place on one of those kind of mid-70s island albums. And there you have it. That's my primer list of 20 John Cale solo tracks spanning his entire career. I did say at various points that I would be doing some additional bits at the end, and I think it would be inexcusable if I didn't touch on some of the other stuff he did, some of those collaborations over the years. Yeah, firstly, Nico, although he was ostensibly just like a producer for Nico, I think John's contributions to her recordings would possibly, deserve, to be considered more of a formal collaboration. I think he had a huge impact on the way those records sounded, at least. These are records like Marble Index or Desert Shore, which I've talked about before. Yeah, there were a pair of collaborations from 1990, which were quite big that year. One was the album Wrong Way Up with Brian Eno. Yeah, this was a notoriously fractious kind of collaboration, despite the fact that they'd played and done stuff together before. Both of their autobiographies do cover this album, and it was a pretty tough session, shall we say. But crucially, it was also very, very productive. This was the return of Brian Eno's singing voice to a record for the first time since 1977, the Before and After Science album. And yeah, crucially, it was John Cale apparently who pushed him into that decision. Yeah, it's just a great kind of avant-garde kind of pop record. Yeah, and from the same year we had Songs for Drella, where John got back together with Lou Reed. I don't know how, but they managed to hold it together long enough to write and record this tribute to the recently departed, well, from 1987, Andy Warhol. Yeah, it's a lovely record, a lovely document, and a marvel that it exists at all. You know, John and Lou never really fully reconciled their differences, so I guess as a tribute to the biggest influence on their creative lives, this was likely to be the only way you could ever realistically, you know, get them back in the same room without, you know, tearing chunks out of each other. And while all the credits on this album are, you know, their co-writing credits, you can easily pick out which are the ones which were John's contributions and which were chiefly Lou's. And some of John's are fantastic. Style it takes, The Trouble with Classicists, and the wonderful kind of spooky spoken word diary piece called A Dream. And a slight footnote, there was also a collaboration with Bob Newworth on the album from 1994, Last Day on Earth. Yeah, collaborations aside, yeah, as we know, John has serious, you know, composing, avant-garde chops. And throughout his career, he's always kind of returned to that. I haven't really touched on that in this kind of song primer, but yet some of his less songy stuff, some of that avant classical drone stuff is definitely worth giving a go. So things like the Church of Anthrax album with Terry Riley from 1971, some of the Inside the Dream Syndicate volumes, which kind of tend to highlight, you know, 1960s recordings of Cale with Lamont Young and all those New York City kind of drone innovators. Also, yeah, he's done a lot of film soundtrack work, some full, you know, OSTs, others just the occasional song contributions. Films here like American Psycho, Basquiat, Something Wild even, and yeah, of course, I Shot Andy Warhol. And in John's back catalogue, there is a liberal sprinkling of live albums. I talked about Sabotage earlier, Sabotage Live. There was Circus Live, Comes Alive, and one called Even Cowgirls Get the Blues, which kind of showcases him at a very particular point playing at CBGB's. But if I was going to highlight a single kind of live recording, it would probably be Fragments of a Rainy Season from 1992. This was John doing essentially a solo thing, just him at the piano, doing versions of his songs from his back catalogue. But this was the one that featured very prominently John's arrangement, you know, by negotiation with Leonard Cohen of Hallelujah. Yeah, John and Leonard were in touch with this, and Leonard managed to give him, you know, lyrics that no one had ever heard before and things like that allowed him to kind of repurpose the song and recast it for solo piano and voice. And whilst this was obviously a great, you know, arrangement and a great cover version of a song that had been kind of quite forgotten in Leonard Cohen's back catalogue, it was actually Jeff Buckley's cover version of John's arrangement itself of that song that really led to its kind of rediscovery and, for a few years at least, you know, absolute ubiquity. Yet lest we forget, this song did feature in the soundtrack to Shrek. So yeah, that's it. Yeah, you see John behind me as he is right now. I think this is quite a contemporary photo of him, and I'm so glad that he is still, you know, releasing music, still pushing the envelope, even at the age of nearly 81. As I say, he's notoriously, you know, not affected at all by nostalgia and always very, very forward-looking. Always looking for new collaborators, and this new album of his, which may be out by the time this video comes out, Mercy, features a number of guests. Yeah, I for one, I'm really looking forward to hearing, you know, what John did next. Yeah, anyway, quite a long one, but I think we need to make a serious effort to kind of, you know, do right by John Cale's amazing back catalogue. Yeah, as usual, I welcome, you know, I welcome your likes, obviously, but I also welcome any comments or questions you might have below the line down there. So that's it. Diolch yn fawr. Hwyl am i tro.